Okay, so we're going to start now. Welcome, everybody. My name is Charles Small. I'm the director of ISGAP, and I'm coming from Oxford, England, where I'm based now in the lockdown. Before I introduce you to our speaker, Professor Uzi Rabi, I also would like to remind everybody that on Wednesday at the same time, 11 a.m. in New York, and 5 p.m. in Europe, and 7 p.m. in Israel, on Wednesday, we're having Professor Amy Elman, and she's going to be discussing the feminist movement and feminist theory and issues of anti-Semitism and anti-Zionism. And it's a very important issue, particularly for the American context, the American intellectual context. And Professor Elman is really doing cutting-edge, very important research on this issue, taking on scholars like Judith Butler and that whole intersectionality debate. So that will be on Wednesday at the same time. So today it's a great privilege and an honor to introduce to you Professor Uzi Rabi. Uzi is a friend and a colleague. Today he's going to be speaking on Corona anti-Semitism in the Middle East. Uzi is a professor, a recently full professor in Tel-Aviv University, recently appointed professor in Tel-Aviv University. He's also the director of the Moshe Dayan Center, one of the most important cutting-edge research centers in Israel on Middle East and African studies. It's based at Tel Aviv University. He's also a professor at the Center of Iranian Studies at Tel Aviv University, and is also formerly the head of the Department of Middle Eastern and African History at Tel Aviv University. And from 2004 to 2005, he was a visiting professor at the Lipinski Institute at San Diego State University. Uzi's research and expertise focuses on modern history and the evolution of the states and societies of the Middle East. He focuses on the Iranian-Arab relations, oil and politics in the Middle East, and the Sunni-Shiite divide and the dynamics within the two competing forces. And within this framework, he has supervised many dissertations and doctoral studies at Tel Aviv universities on this interdisciplinary study of the Middle East. And he's been doing really cutting-edge research on issues related to the work of ISGAP on anti-Semitism, but also to the sort of profound and structural changes that have swept the Middle East in the last decade. Uzi's really been at the forefront of understanding the redrawing of the Middle East on the map. So it's really an honor to have Uzi with us again. Uzi's been teaching at our summer institute, I think every year since we've been there. Uzi's been there teaching an important component of our program. So it's really a pleasure to have you here with us today, Uzi, in this new age of the Zoom webinars. So welcome, Uzi.
Thanks a lot, Charles. So, hello, everybody. And, I'll just start with kind of a short presentation about Corona and anti-Semitism in the Middle East. And of course, when it comes to our notion, we know that anti-Semitism had been there since times immemorial. Basically, things were reflected in medieval Europe when it comes to the Black Death, and we have seen that a lot even after that when it comes to the modern days or early modern. What we have noticed is that modernity did not mean that any progress in the sense of actually stop accusing the other or demonizing the other, which was to accompany pandemics. So basically, Jews and pandemics, or Jews had many encounters in history with pandemics, and maybe the most notable example would be the Black Death. But of course, thereafter, we had seen that with the Spanish flu, with the typhus microbe when it comes to Nazi propaganda, and of course, all these blood libels which relates to modern Europe or Western Europe, there was something that is really there. And I think that what was created is sort of an old baggage that was to be adapted or fully adapted in the Middle East in the 20th century. It is not to say that anti-Semitism was not there in the Middle East before. Of course, we know a lot about the Damascus blood libel and some other incidents. But when it comes to the Middle East, in its new shape, which means a Middle East which is composed of states and nations in the 20th century, and especially after the World War II, and the creation of Israel, what we had seen there is kind of that kind of longevity and persistence of anti-Jewish hatred, basically coming up together, hand in hand with the anti-Israeli motives. And this is something that Israel had witnessed from its very creation in 1948. And I think that something that was there all the way is what we had said before about the history of pandemics and anti-Semitism. As epidemics or pandemics spread, Jew hatred followed. And basically, this was a kind of a rule. It didn't matter how, where, when, to what extent. We know a lot now after having felt what a disease feels like when it comes to the nowadays pandemic, the coronavirus. We know that people actually, while in a kind of a situation of uncertainty, when people are very, very worried and anxious about their own health and how to make a living, and many, many questions which are being arisen and being asked with no answer, the trend or the tendency, I would say, more often than not, is to put the blame on what we call the other. Well, the other could be many, but basically since Jews were almost everywhere and they constituted one way or the other, more often than not, actually, Jews were blamed on those pandemics and paid a heavy price when it comes to, as we mentioned, the Black Death or the typhus microbe theme, which was one of the main themes of Nazi propaganda. But when it comes to the Middle East, it was a kind of, I would say, an amalgam of two main accusations of Arabs or Middle Easterners against Israel. The first of which was that Israel was a Trojan horse. As if to say that it was now a mere coincidence that Israel was created in 1948, which was very, very close to what we call the pull-out of Western powers of the Middle East. So in the Arab mind, and I happen to see that in abundance time and again, what was basically stuck in the back of the mind of many, many Arabs in the Middle East or Middle Easterners is that Israel was created as kind of an alternative to the Western presence in the Middle East. So from the beginning, 1948, Israel was seen by many Middle Easterners as kind of the tail of the Western dog, so to speak. It is as if we have a Trojan horse being put or installed in the Middle East in order to preserve Western interests after the West had pulled out of the region. The second thing that became very, very notorious and valid and evident in this reality is the accusation or the attempt through which to describe Israel as a kind of uniquely Nazi state, racist state, which is acting in the Middle East as kind of a replica of, as I said before, fascist and racist regimes. Of course, from that stage in the Middle East, more often than not, the term Jews in Arabic, Yahud, and the term Zionist in Arabic, Sahayna, or even Israelis, had been interchangeably used in order to say that there was a sort of a similarity which was to be seen between Jews and Israel. And as we know, actually, while going through the 20th century to the 21st century, we dare say that one of the signs of new anti-Semitism is to put the blame on Israel for many things that are being done by Jews and vice versa. So there is, I mean, the divisions lines are being blurred to a large extent. What we got here is kind of a situation which is very, very typical to what we see these days. Now, coronavirus swept also the Middle East, not you know, it was not that penetrating as what we see in Western Europe. But let me show you some of the reflections, cartoons, which were raised by, you know, the Palestinian Authority, at times actually the Gazan authorities. Of course, we should not forget the coming to the fore of Iran in 1979. This was a new nature of state and society. At least what we got from 1979 onwards was Islamic Republic. And it is well known that one of the main things that Iranians were to come up with was in Farsi, Israel Bayad Mahshabad, which means that Israel has no right to exist and it should be demolished in no time. And of course, this is a kind of a byproduct of what we call, let's say, fundamentalist Islamic thought, which is based on a kind of puritanistic interpretation of the Shari'i law, of the Islamic law, which says that Jews do not have the right for sovereignty. But since then, actually, Israel has become a kind of a fact in the Middle East. And of course, when it comes to humanitarian crisis like the coronavirus, what we can see here, if we can see that in the PowerPoint, well, just a minute. When it comes to the Palestinian Authority, what one can see is a kind of a very, very vitriolic campaign against Israel, as if Israel is exporting the virus into Judea and Samaria in order to poison Palestinians and get rid of them. Ironic how it may sound, it was at the midst of an Israeli effort to support Palestinian Authority, and no other than the health minister of the Palestinian Authority. She came up with kind of blame, which she made it publicly, by which to say that, well, Israel is the culprit behind the event. Of course, after some warnings coming from Israel, actually Palestinians stopped that. But, when it comes to the idea of how the street was to accept that, I would say that to a large extent, a Palestinian in the first place were of the opinion that this is kind of a real fact. So these fake news actually dealing with the, new media devices and all that stuff, we got here a sort of a problem when it comes to the Palestinian Authority. You can also see that this was not only a thing that was typical to the Palestinian Authority. Many in Gaza were of the opinion that the same scenario is happening in Gaza. And if you can see that in the PowerPoint, actually this cartoon, which came from a Gazan artist, so to speak, was to... אני לא מצליח להזיז את זה. Oh, here is it. This is kind of the David Star. You can see that, but it is crowned with Corona. And this was kind of a cartoon that was published in Gaza in the heyday of the coronavirus pandemics, as if to say that this is something that comes from Israel. Basically, the coronavirus, when it comes to many Middle Easterners, at this example, Palestinians sitting in Gaza, but also in Judea and Samaria, they came up with the accusation by which to say that Israel is the culprit behind the event. Of course, it was said, it was published, it was, I would say, to a large extent, digested by many Palestinians, while Israel was helping Palestinians out in confronting the pandemics. Because, of course, it is well known that Israel didn't have any idea or any interest in kind of that saga in the Palestinian Authority, because this would harm Israel's interests too. And of course, this is also a humanitarian saga that nobody would like actually to see in the Middle East. I think that that was part and parcel of many other things that could be seen in the Middle East. Let me conclude actually by saying that even when it comes to Ramadan times, I mean, which were in tandem with the corona pandemics, there was a kind of a TV private channel, Egyptian, that brought in sort of a program which was based on this topic drama of 2120, which in retrospect speaks about what happened in 248, which is 28 years from now on. Well, this was, of course, skyrocketed when it comes to the rating, because people in Ramadan see what the Egyptian actually TV has to offer. And this has become a foci and the talk of the day. But basically what we had seen there is a kind of drama, which is titled An-Nihaya, which means the end. Basically, that was the end of Israel. So in a classroom being taught in Cairo, Egypt, in 2120, the teacher explains to the students what happened in 2048 and brought in the annihilation of Israel, because Arabs were united. United States was very weak, and that was high time for the Arabs to take revenge of Israel and demolish Israel and force the Jews go back to their European origins. Well, that was very hilarious, because, I mean, not hilarious said, of course, but the funny thing is that it didn't mention the fact that many Jews actually were originated in Arab states. So they talked about actually Jews getting back to their homeland in Europe. But that was something that was, I'd say, one way or the other sign of the times. But at the same time, there were some glimpses of hope for Israel. Let me just conclude by that, saying that, even Palestinians came up with that kind of a cartoon, which spoke about the tatbi'a, which is normalization of Arab states with Israel, as kind of a coronavirus pandemics, which had affected many, many Arabs as to turn to the other side of the road, start talking to Israel, coming up with sort of a cooperation with Israel. So, it is very sad actually when it comes to pandemics and anti-Semitism, because there is sort of a rule by that. But I still hope and think that the mere geopolitics, at least when it comes to the Middle East in the 21st century, are fostering sort of a change in style and thought of some Arab states while referring to Israel. It is more often than not, my enemy's enemy can be my friend. It is more often than not that the Palestinian cause is not that instrumental for their day-to-day affairs and running their own businesses. And since actually we have a very fragmented Middle East Middle Eastern panorama, some of the states actually are really put in front their particular agenda, and some of them actually, in that sense, cross the Rubicon as to cooperate even partially with Israel. Not very often publicly, because this is not healthy, politically speaking. It's not politically correct in the Middle East. But as we know today, Israel has many wide and effective relationships with some of the Arab states. So maybe this would help us in at least decreasing the tone that we had seen there. Of course, what I said has to do with the leadership. The problem is well installed in the street, in the educational curricula, and of course, only change in that fold would create kind of a better atmosphere in the 21st century. I'll stop here because I think that I would love, of course, to take your comment or questions or whatever queries in order to just have a discussion. Charles?
So Uzi, thank you very much for your insights and for leading off the conversation. And now people who are listening, you could submit your questions and I'll put them to Uzi. So I'll start off with a quick question. So Uzi, at the beginning of the lockdown and the pandemic, the Palestinian Authority was, as you point out, was really rife with anti-Semitism and blaming Jews for the pandemic and ugly forms of anti-Semitic rhetoric and cartoons. And you spoke about the Ramadan series in Egypt, but I'm also thinking that there was some positive material coming out in the Gulf states, and I think in Saudi Arabia, where Jews were depicted a bit more positive. So I was wondering, so there are some positive depictions of Jews, and maybe Jews of the Middle East, maybe not directly Israel, but certainly Jews of the Middle East. And given the changing geostrategic affairs of the Middle East and the fear of the Sunni states of Iran, and now even in some instances, the Muslim Brotherhood, did you detect any attempt in the Middle East to kind of tell the Palestinians to stop trading in this anti-Semitism? Was there any backlash against it or not really?
Well, I mean, Charles, this is right to the point. First of all, actually, this is exactly what I tried to say, that when it comes to, for example, the Gulf states, you could say kind of programs which were brought in during Ramadan times. And in Kuwait, it was Harun, which is Harun's mother. In Saudi Arabia, it was Mahraj 7. But in any case, those were two programs that were to, I would say, to shed some light about the era where Jews were part and parcel, let's say, of Kuwait and in some Arab states, and Jews were, in a way, re-legitimized in those programs, But let me just make sure, Charles, that we understand that when it comes to Kuwait and Saudi Arabia, it is sort of a top-down affair. I was disappointed to see the opposite in Egypt, which I knew that this program of Egyptian nature came from a private TV channel, but the Egyptian censor did not prevent it. And this is what I'm trying to say. Yes, I fully agree with you. There is a change in the Middle East. And in some cases, there is kind of an attempt by Muslims and by Middle Easterners to rehabilitate the memory of Jewry in the Middle East. And I can tell that, when it comes to Iraq, which is the state where my parents actually were born there and came from, I can tell you that even today, we have some dialogues with Iraqis about the rehabilitation of Jewish memory in Iraq. And, we are doing things together, academically speaking, some cultural initiatives. And this is, I think, very, very lively and promising. But again, I mean, if we are talking in kind of a broad, or we would like to have a broad stroke here, what I think should come to the fore is something that has to do with the educational stuff. As long as the educational stuff is built up on what we see, actually what we saw in the 50s and the 60s about what Israel is and how Israel should be treated, I think that a major change is not in the offing. Having said that, and let me tell you, actually, we have just ended sort of a survey about the Saudi textbooks. There you can see kind of a change, which is, in my opinion, to a large extent, the byproduct of the initiatives taken by Mohammed bin Salman, the Saudi heir, which, who is one way or the other says loud and clear, Israel is not my enemy, Iran is my enemy. And to some extent, actually, I would say, speak a little bit harshly to the Palestinians, asking them to start or becoming much more productive when it comes to the conflict and the geopolitics of the Middle East. So he can be used as an example to what you said, Charles, but still, I think, and this is what I do assert time and again, that a real change is going to be seen there only if and when some other content is being inserted to the curricula as to accept Israel as a legitimate state. And from there on, I'm pretty sure that things are going to become clearer and much more healthier when it comes to the Middle East. In some cases, it's not a top-down affair, and the street is controlling the rhythm. And when it comes to Egypt and Jordan, even if the leadership is accepting Israel, and even if we have peace treaty with those states, more often than not, you would be surprised to hear that the anti-Semitic motives in the street when it comes to Cairo and Amman are skyrocketing, are very, very harsh. And this is, I think, part of the problem which I actually try to raise.
So, Uzi, just very quickly as a follow-up, do you think, A, that the Saudi changes to the textbook, it's a momentary situation, or do you think it's a short-term situation, or could develop into something more long-term?
Well, I think that this is a real change, and I hope that it would prevail there in order to actually educate the next generation in the Gulf in kind of a way that would talk or accept Israel as kind of a fact. I'm not saying that Israel is immune of mistakes. I'm not saying that criticism should not be raised. No, but I, to a large extent, very, very happy to see that when it comes to Gulf leaderships, most of them treat Israel in kind of a different manner than it used to be in the 20th century. It is based on the live and let live notion. And when it comes to so many things that are being done together, this is kind of a model that I would like actually to see being elaborated and developed there. And I do hope that this is a momentary, of a momentary nature. I would say that, you know, in the Middle East, and you said that, Charles, and I must just recall and emphasize that, you know, there are so many conflicts in the Middle East nowadays. It's not only the Palestinian-Israeli, of course. It has become, relatively speaking, a marginal conflict. We definitely talk about the Arab-Iranian rift. And when it comes to the coronavirus, you know, the Arab press was top to bottom, full of accusations against the Shia militias that Iran installed in Arab countries as the bridgehead by which to bring in the virus into the Arab fold. And, you know, it is also the me and the other game. But when it comes to that, it could just shed some light about the problematics in the Middle East. It is so complicated when it comes to the geopolitical panorama that you have some risks and you have some cons. But, you know, when you look at that, there are many chances and opportunities that should be capitalized on. And I dare say that Israel and some Arab states actually rose to the occasion as to conclude or to foster kind of a very effective cooperation that is based, I guess, on this, you know, practical cooperation. But I would like actually to see a continuation, which is going to be not in a full peace treaty. I'm not talking about full normalization. But what I would like actually to have in the first place is inserting, as I've said before, some fresh thoughts and different outlook about what Israel is, how Israel should be referred to, and what is the basic treatment Israel should get. If I see in the Saudi textbooks a simple word named Israel, not Zionist entity, as was the case before, I know that there is a change. This is, for me, something that means a even dramatic change, and I hope that we'll see a lot of that in the future.
I hope so too. So I have just a follow-up question, then I'm going to refer to some of the questions that people are submitting.
Please.
You know, at ISGAP, we were looking at sort of neoliberal policies, globalization, and the impact that this has had on marginality for the last several decades, the structural adjustment and neoliberalism. And we were talking about the Arab Spring. I think in Tunisia, sort of marginalized people actually started the revolt in Tunisia, and it became the Arab Spring, which perhaps later became the Islamic Winter. So as the coronavirus sort of wreaks havoc on the economy, on the global economy, and you touched on some of the bottom down, what's happening in Egypt on the street, or Jordan on the street, as the economic crisis of coronavirus really, it's profound in its implications. Do you think the stability of the region is going to shift? We see in Lebanon now, there's been a bit of a backlash that's transcending the Shiite Sunni Christian cleavages, but it's becoming more economic. What is going to happen in these very fragile societies?
Well, it is a real heavy questions, but it is again right to the point. You know, we do think a lot about ourselves and about everybody when it comes to the post-corona era. But one can tell, Charles, that when it comes to the Middle East, any thought of recuperation of the Middle East, any thought of repairing the damage that was inflicted in the last decade with this whole humanitarian saga, well, there is no money in world number one to be poured on the Middle East anymore because of the coronavirus. And I tend to say that all these initiatives that were there, or there was some beginnings of that, are going to be postponed. And this by itself definitely would widen or sharpen the rift between rulers and ruled. When it comes to a state like Iran, it remains to be seen actually what kind of Iran we're going to see now, or we're going to get. Even Ayatollahs and revolutionary guards are very, very, they know that Iran is in a questionable or kind of a crossroads, and we'll have to wait and see. As you said, in Egypt and in some other states, what can be seen is the re-eruption of a second wave of rulers-ruled conflict. You know, when I ask people in the Arab world, actually before the Corona days, what they think about the Arab Spring, they said, listen, we got something, most of it we didn't get, but you know, we are so tired, we wouldn't like actually to see any revolution because it comes to nothing. Now I don't know, because people are so desperate, and you know, Charles, we do see that when it comes to the, the social networks. I mean, people do talk, people come up with so many indications as to how lousy their life is. So, I mean, if you ask me, we are in kind of a second transitory phase in the Middle East, and coronavirus could be seen in retrospect as kind of a trigger to some more changes that are going to be inflicted on the Middle East. We'll have to wait and see, but we know that, we put things in general mode, but every state, it's for own course, and every state has to be for the analysis of a certain state, you have to be acquired or equipped with, let's say, kind of an understanding of the culture, language, of the ritual, of let us say, the different, as you said, Charles, the different camps or parties you have there. It could be Sunni Shia, it could be minorities, it could be Muslim brothers versus secularists, so to speak. So many schisms that, without that, it could be a very, very clear page. But this is exactly the opposite. What we got in the Middle East is many, many conflicts, which are going to be bolstered because of the humanitarian crisis. And since we have here failed states like Libya, Yemen, Iraq, Syria, all the more reason why we should, as you put in your question, we should suspect, or we should just think thoroughly about the instability that is going to be sweeping the region, and who knows what that would bring in.
Okay, thanks, Uzi. So in relation to this issue, we have a question from Mehdi Askria. I hope I'm pronouncing his name right, Askaria. And he asks you, Uzi, how short-sighted and superficial is it to rely on bringing changes to the fight against anti-Semitism with the current undercurrents in the Middle East by relying on NBS, who's not reliable? And what does the state of Israel do to help fight anti-Semitism in the Arab culture from the streets?
Sure. First of all, it's a good question, and I said that this is what I meant by saying top down. When I said top down and mentioned MBS, I meant that this is an artificial thing. And it has to do with the political agenda of Saudi Arabia. This current heir, who I think is going to be the king, is very, very dominant and instrumental in Saudi Arabia. And he comes up with kind of a vision for Saudi Arabia. And in this vision, Israel is not an enemy, one way or the other. And I'm not saying that he likes Israel. What I just say is that Israel, for MBS, is not an enemy, and it would be counterproductive for Saudi Arabia to go for Israel. Now, what he does is something that comes top down, and I think that we should hope that this thing is going to be grasped by some quarters of the Saudi society. I can tell that Saudis and Israelis do meet each other, do some businesses together. We come to know each other. We do see that they are human beings and us, Israelis, human beings. And of course, nobody is forcing himself on the other when it comes to culture, religion, etc. Isn't that what we would like to have in the end of the day? This is exactly what we would like to have. Real intimacy, full intimacy. Well, I do not speak that way. I think that this would be a mere naivete to hope for that kind of a thing. But I simply say that if there is kind of an atmosphere with which actually to change things, it should come from the educational curricula. And as long as there is no an authentic effort to bring that in, that would be something that, will lag behind, But in the meantime, Israel should definitely bring itself in when it comes to its cultures, its problems, its attributes, cooperation with some Arab states. Your question is right in place, but it's a long process. Yeah. There is no actually one shot with which actually to resolve the problem. Definitely not. So I'm not saying that he is the Messiah, MBS. And I know that this guy is very, very, he could be very cruel, and he is very assertive, especially when it comes to Iran. But, as an Israeli, I am thrilled to see that there are some Arab leaders who are going all the way to change actually this rhythm, which was there all the days, because Israel is not Arab states' problem. This is what they got and what they realized. I do hope that this would be kind of a gate through which all of us going to go in and just together try to build up a different agenda. Of course, Israel has to be there. And I think that what Israel is trying to do, and this is my advice to Israel, Israel should not perform as a purely Western state. Israel is a state in the Middle East. Arabic is kind of a language which is being spoken in Israel. 20% of the Israeli citizens are Palestinians. And basically, we should turn them into kind of a bridge through which to talk to the Arab states and the Middle East and create a better Middle East for all of us.
Just briefly, we have many questions, but you raise an interesting point. Do you think that that's beginning to happen a bit with the region in turmoil? Are Palestinian Israelis becoming more integrated into the economy, more integrated politically? Is there a shift because it's so difficult on the other side of the border?
No doubt. First of all, Palestinians in Israel, I can tell actually loud and clear that they are fully integrated into the economy, and they are Palestinians, and nobody's going to change that because they have their own people and they do identify themselves as Palestinians. But I dare say that they are much more Israelis than they used to be. And this, for me, is kind of a sign by which to build up a healthier ethos for Israel. As for the Palestinians sitting in the West Bank in Gaza, of course, this is something that is still there. This is a real problem. Well, let us don't forget that Palestinians have been neglected by the world and the Arab states. They used to be kind of a very, very dear favorite in the 20th century. They are no more of a favorite in the 21st century. As I said before, everybody has its own problems. So Palestinians should come to the reality with kind of a much more realistic understanding. And I hope that there would be kind of an agreement with which our cooperation with Palestinians is going to be bolstered and strengthened. And let me tell you, Charles, what Israelis and Palestinians have on ground when it comes to the economic ventures is unprecedented. The problem is, when it comes to the political echelons, things are getting worse. I mean, things are getting toward the wrong direction. So again, I think that we in the academia, people of the economic fold, we have kind of a role to take upon ourselves in just bringing in kind of a message of cooperation, of dialogue. We could, and definitely you could have that in the south and in close to the West Bank and even nearby Gaza. You could see some stuff which is being actually developed because of Israeli-Palestinian cooperation. When it comes to agriculture, when it comes to industry, when it comes to many, many things, politics remains the problem everywhere. And I do hope that we shall prevail, because people in the end of the day would like to have kind of better life for themselves, and mainly, especially for their next generation. And if they are coming up with that, we're going to have something which is totally different. This is what I hope.
Thanks, Uzi. And now to shift gears a little bit, we have a question from Andrea Spindle. And she asks, as Turkey is becoming increasingly anti-Semitic and perhaps the real home of the Muslim Brotherhood, what would Israel like the European Union and Western Europe to do? And is there any response coming from the European Union in its relations with Turkey and the virulent anti-Semitism that it's exporting into Europe and around the world?
Well, I don't think that, well, to some extent, maybe Europe could serve as sort of a go-between or intermediary, but we know that Recep Tayyip Erdogan has many, many problems with the European Union for many reasons. I think that what Erdogan actually chose to do 20 years ago is to just foster kind of a policy by which to support Muslim brothers to go for Israel in kind of a vitriolic way. That was his, main card, and he thought and still thinks that this is the best for Turkey. I think that the cards were not played good by Erdogan in the recent years, as we can see, and now maybe it's a time to just, start rethinking about Israel's relations with Erdogan. From time to time, he is changing tones. Actually, he is sending to Gaza via Israel some support to the Gazans due to the coronavirus, and Israel is happy to do that. But again, I don't think that Erdogan has in mind kind of a second Marmara, if you can recall that. Erdogan has many, many damages to deal with when it comes to the Russians coming to the fore, when it comes to even Syria and some portions of it. He didn't get what he wants with the Kurds in the end of the day. And I think that Turkey is becoming kind of a camp by itself, leading, as the questions that was put was rightly put, saying that he supports the Muslim Brothers. He is just cooperating with Qatar. But you see what goes on here? I mean, he is becoming sort of a rival to the Sunni moderate states, which is Egypt and Jordan and Saudi Arabia, and all of these would rather have Israel as kind of a cooperation than Erdogan. And we didn't talk about Iran, and we didn't talk about ISIS being re-emerged in those war-torn countries like Syria, Iraq, Yemen, and even Libya. So I don't think that this is kind of a Middle East by which to come up with grand design. So Erdogan is smart, and he knows actually what is better for himself. And I think that when he reads the map, he is going to recalculate. And I hope that his recalculation would bring a little bit more moderate tone when it comes to Israel. I do not hope for kind of a real change, but at least actually changing the tone, trying actually to be much more realistic and cooperative. And I hope that this would also help both Turkey and Israel for a kind of a better situation.
Thank you. We have another question from Rami Aziz. And Rami asks, how can the peace treaty between Egypt and Israel be used to combat anti-Semitism, sort of as a kind of, to extract a kind of commitment from Egypt as the signer of the peace agreement? Do they have a role to play in combating anti-Semitism?
Definitely. First of all, Rami, we have to believe in it. Definitely. We know that, the incumbent in Egypt has many problems from the in and out. It's not just Muslim brothers. It is still some Salafi jihadi circles in Sinai, in the Sinai Peninsula. And from time to time, Israel is being asked to help out the Egyptians in that. And this is, of course, kind of a mutual benefit. But also Israel and Egypt has many, many things in common when it comes to industry, agriculture, and a lot of stuff. What I think, and I tell you, Rami, this is my conclusion. It seems that it will be very, very problematic to sell Israel in a different way other than the practical manner. People should learn easily and gradually what the fruits of peace that was signed in 1979 are when it comes to Egypt. I mean, this is the only thing, because to come in one shot and make Egyptians actually think conversely or alternatively in Israel as kind of a good guys, this would be very, very difficult. So let's just have some patience, as we say actually in the Middle East, Allahu ma'as sabirin. Those who have patience are going actually to prevail in the Middle East. What Israel and Egypt should do together is, when it comes to the practical field, show how beneficial this peace is for both peoples, Egyptian and Israel. On the second drive, what we have to do is to bring in gradually and being very, very prudent some cultural tones or voices which reflect the Israeli fold and the Egyptian fold, and vice versa. So I would like to see some more Egyptians in Israel. There is no tourism. No Egyptians do visit Israel. Why is that? Today, I dare say that Israelis are few and far between too. It's not because of Corona and just terror and all that stuff. Well, tourism should be flourished, because this is the best way to make those two people actually become familiar with each other. And of course, education for the long run, tourism for the medium run, practical cooperation for the short run. This is a very Sisyphic march, tough and difficult. But if we are there on both sides, we're going to get it in the end of the day. So let's start move. There is no kind of a winning formula. It will take time. But the more we get now, the better for the future.
Thanks, Uzi. And we're going to take one final question. We have time for one more question from Professor David Patterson. And he asks you that you mentioned anti-Semitism in school curricula. What has to be done with religious instruction with regard to softening its view of Israel? We often point out the importance of religion in these societies, yet what can be done to deal with anti-Semitism and the role or the place of Israel in the world today from a religious perspective?
And I think that that's a great question. And, I would take it to the question that was raised by Rami before and say that, when it comes to, let us say, Islam is not a kind of a monolith, as we know. And there are people of Al-Azhar, and there are people who are much more moderate and much more Puritanist, and Salafis and others. So we have an orchestra of voices. Yes, I think that religion has a role. In Israel, when it comes to Judaism, in Egypt, when it comes to Islam, or the Arab world, when it comes to Islam. We should just try to make him familiar with me, and vice versa. It's not kind of an either or. It's not kind of a zero-sum game. It's not that I'm going to actually to get kind of a bigger slice at the expense of him. It is the respecting him for his otherness. with me actually be knowledgeable that I cannot change him and I shouldn't, and he should not do that to me. And this is why we say, Charles, that the bottom line would be respect the otherness of the other. And by the way, this is what we are trying to do in Israel these days, because we know that we didn't do that, and we got many rifts between ultra-Orthodox and Palestinians and those and Druze and seculars and people of Bnei Barak and Tel Aviv and Jerusalem. And this is just a tiny state. If you are that clever to understand that you have many, many subcultures, and you should not come up with the melting pot analysis, but with respecting the other for his otherness, you're going to build up, in the end of the day, a healthier ethos for your own state. I would take that with a broad perspective and try to implement that over the Middle East, because the disease, the pandemics of the Middle East is what I call primordial identities. People are stuck in their original identity. They are so suspicious about the other that there is no way actually to just come up with something which would be of a different nature when it comes to state and society. So this is why I say it's step by step. Yes, we have to do with, it has to do with the leadership, but it wouldn't be only the leadership. It should be the clerics, those who are ready and willing to do that. It should be some people of the intelligentsia. How very surprising. In the Egyptian intelligentsia, we have some harsh voices against Israel. So let's hope for the good. And for me, it's kind of one step in a long march. And I'm pretty sure that if that is the spirit that is going to be adopted by all, this would be actually something by which to make sure that all of us are going to prevail in a much better Middle East in the future.
So Uzi, thank you. So on behalf of the ISGAP team, thank you very much. So Professor Uzi Rabi, the director of the
Thanks a lot, Charles. Thank you so much.
Dayan Center for Middle East and African Studies. For those who are listening, Uzi's books and articles are widely available. You can Google them and you can order his books online. It's very important. His research is very important for the contemporary, rapidly changing region of the Middle East. So Uzi, thanks for joining us and taking your time. Look forward to being in touch.
Thank you, Charles.
And thank you. And then everybody who's listening to Wednesday at the same time, we have Amy Ellman dealing with issues of gender and the women's movement and anti-Semitism, anti-Israel bashing. So that's an important issue domestically, particularly in the West and in the United States. So Uzi, thank you. Stay safe, everybody. And
thanks a lot, Charles. Thank you, guys. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Take care. Thank you, Yuval.
Yuval,